Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Touchdown Tuesdays, the official football podcast of Brew Sports. My name is Ian DeMars. I'm alongside Ryan Solomon here with the most up-to-date action in the NFL. Ryan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. Not because of the NFL, though. Doing pretty well because the Brewers are doing well and the Bucks are doing well. So it's a good time to be a Wisconsin sports fan.
Yeah, for both of us living in Wisconsin, it seems kind of weird to see that the Packers right now seem like the third team of the major sports team in the area. It's kind of bizarre seeing the Brewers have a lot of success and the Bucks have a lot of success, but the Packers, they're on the tail end of that over the last couple of years.
Yeah, and Ian and I are both like in our mid-20s, and my dad still tells me about when the Packers used to be just horrendous before I was born. So I guess that people are kind of used to the Packers having a drought if they were born before we were, but we've always had Packers teams that are contending for playoffs and Super Bowls.
Yeah, and I mean, who knows? Maybe this upcoming year could be the thing that turns things around. But there is one thing that does not appear to be turning around, and that's where we have to start. Typically, when we start the show, we focus mainly on the NFL. But today, I think we know where we have to start. Do you know what I'm talking about, Ryan?
Oh, absolutely. It's the other football league that we talk about every week, the AAF. And it looks like, for the time being at least, it's going to be shutting down.
Yeah, so the reports came out today that the majority owner, Tom Dundon, Carolina Panthers owner or Carolina Hurricanes owner, who funded the league with over $250 million, basically came to the point last week. He wasn't really sure how the league was looking. He was looking to make it more of a developmental league like Bill Polian and Charlie Episode wanted, but the NFL Players Association wasn't coming to terms with the AALF or getting the opportunity to grab some of the practice squad players during the season because of the fact that they're still technically part of the NFL team. Now, the AAF wanted to get these players opportunities to actually get playing time in game. However, they weren't coming to terms on it, and it came to that point last week where Dundon said a possibility could be having the league fold. And it's now at that point where he has suspended all league operations with only 2 weeks left in the regular season, 4 weeks left overall. They have 2 weeks of postseason play. It's an unfortunate time for the Alliance because it seemed like things were looking really well for the league. The viewership was, I think, right where you wanted to be for a first-year league. They had some nice high-profile names in the league as well, and some teams that were playing very well in this league. So what's your first thoughts on this?
Well, I'm a little confused about it because everybody that's in the AAF isn't somebody that's actually even associated with the NFL anymore. So we talked about the last couple of weeks of Johnny Manziel coming onto a team. He wasn't part of a practice squad or anything, so I'm sort of confused as to why not being able to reach an agreement with NFL teams to use their practice squad players would cause the league to fold.
Yeah, it's really confusing. And I think the most confusing part about this is that the timing they decided to do it. They had 4 weeks left in the whole season. Like, you're telling me that you couldn't wait till the end of the season, hash this out with the Players Association for a couple of months, and maybe then come to terms on folding the league? It makes no sense to fold the league when just last week we saw some high quality games. We saw some high scoring games. We saw some very good defensive scoring, low scoring games. So it was just a weird time to see the league fold. If this would have happened 1 to 2 months after the season had finished, it might not be a surprise to people looking things over. But the timing of this just doesn't really make sense, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with that also. It sort of seems to me like there's something else going on behind the scenes. Like perhaps the league was losing large sums of money and they didn't see it collecting that money back. And then they sort of use this as a scapegoat, just because I don't see that many players being associated with the NFL that are in the AAF, like I said. So I would think that if the NFL didn't lease any of their players to the AAF, it wouldn't be like, oh, okay, let's fold. It would be like, okay, let's deal with what we have. And so that's a little confusing to me. And I kind of wonder if it's not more like the old XFL where they were losing money and they couldn't recoup any of it. And that league is more folding because of that rather than the NFL's unwillingness to work with them.
Yeah, and the thing with the money is that when you start a huge league like this, you have to realize that you're not going to make money in this league right away. It might take you 2 to 3 years or so until you actually make a profit in this league. I mean, you look at the attendance in the games, for example, you could see a decent portion of the teams can fill basically half the stadium. Obviously, some of this is because the newer teams, the fans or the people in the area really don't know what to expect. But a lot of these people that buy into these leagues, they pull out so early just because they're not willing to lose money over the first couple of years. When you look at down the line, they could actually maybe possibly double their money out of it. It's just an unfortunate time. And I know you had mentioned the XFL before. There were some issues that happened with the XFL when it first started. There was obviously, if you've watched the 30 for 30 on it, you saw that in the second week they had some issues where cameras went down, so they couldn't really get the game, they couldn't film the games. And then there was also an issue where the game was filmed on NBC and Saturday Night Live had to be delayed because of one of the games going on. So that was some of the issues. But there have been some issues in the AAF as well. Early in the season, there were reports that they were losing money because players weren't getting their checks on time, although reports were that because of the holiday, that's why checks were delayed. There are also reports that one of the teams actually had to practice 3 hours from where they're located because of insurance issues. There's been reports that where the championship game was supposed to be was moved to Texas, to where I think it's one of Dallas, the Cowboys practice facility. And where they were supposed to have it, apparently it was supposed to be in Las Vegas, but the owners of the field had like no recognition of them actually giving the okay to play the championship game there. So there's a lot of misleading stuff that we really don't know about yet. And I think a lot of this is going to be coming out to the news over the next couple of days or over the next month. And it's going to be interesting to see how this league ranks to what the XFL was when they first started. Because if you want me to be honest, I think this league was going to have a lot of success. And the issue with the first XFL is that because it was partly owned by WWF at the time, then it made it seem like it wasn't all focused on football. This was all focused about football, the AAF. And it's just unfortunate to see it fold so early.
Yeah, from what I saw, they did a pretty good job putting a product on the field. It was actually a digestible product that you could talk about. It had players that you sort of knew, like Trent Richardson. And it is a little sad to see it fold. I don't know if there's a possibility that it could get back up and running if they actually do figure out whatever they needed to with the NFL contracts, or if that's just a scapegoat, like I said. But I would like to see it come back because I don't think we got a good enough sample size to see if this could actually be successful. And after what I assume would have been very careful planning and knowing that you wouldn't be able to make money right away and that for a few years it would basically be a money pit, knowing that they must have planned for that and then still not being able to deal with that and folding after year one would be kind of a big letdown.
Yeah, and if you're looking at the new XFL, which is set to start in 2020, you're looking at what Vince McMahon has done with this league. He's taken so many of his stocks from WWE and has sold them so he can have this league financially set. And it's at that point where there are reports that this league, the XFL, should be set financially for up to 3 years. And I think that could have been an issue with the AAF. If they didn't have the funding to cover over multiple years, that can be an issue. If you only have enough funding for one season, then where are you going to get the funding for the years to come? You have to make sure that you have the funding for the amount of time that you're hoping to experiment with the league. And a lot of these leagues that develop have issues with that because they only focus on 1 to 2 years. Vince McMahon, I think, learned from this now and is set to where he can have this league run for at least a few years, try and get some success out of it, and try and get his money back after year 3 ends. And I think that the XFL The new one is going to learn a lot from this and is actually going to benefit a lot more now because of what just happened.
Yeah, and we talked earlier about if the XFL is going to be more successful than the AAF, and it's looking like it's probably going to at this point if it makes it an entire season. So sad way for the AAF to sort of end if it does end here.
Yeah, it is very unfortunate, but if we do have to crown a champion of the league today, it would be your Orlando Apollos, who did get a big win on Saturday in Memphis. It was a very difficult game, though. The weather was not the best. It was windy. The rain was coming down. There was some controversy at the end, but your Apollos did come out with the victory. But let's move on now to, I guess, what we can say for now is going to be a final breakdown from this past week. So, in our weekly standings, we both actually did very well. Ryan, you had a record of 3-1. I actually got all four of my picks right. So, as of right now, I'm not sure what'll happen, but my record will stand at 16-12. Yours will be at 13-15. But your Apollos, as of right now, are the league champions. I guess you have to put an asterisk at the end of it just because of the fact that they didn't finish the season. What were your thoughts on this past week?
I mean, it was kind of like what we expected. For most of the season, we haven't been making super great picks, especially I haven't. But to finally get one where we sort of got a feel for how the teams actually were, it was much easier to make picks now. Everything sort of settled into how it was supposed to be and seemingly was going to be throughout the rest of the season had it been played. So like we could tell which teams were the best, we could tell which teams were the worst. It wasn't as much parity anymore. So that's probably one of the biggest takeaways from the week is that we could see who was finally the best and we could tell who was kind of lagging behind the pack.
Yeah, and you look at some of the breakout performances this past week. Trent Richardson actually did have his best week in the Alliance. He had over 80 yards rushing. He was near 5 yards average per carry. Did score another touchdown as well. Ends what is expected to be the only Alliance season with 11 rushing touchdowns. Garrett Gilbert was the main focal point in the passing game. In the Alliance, his teammate Charles Johnson was one of the main receivers in the league as well. But we also, Arizona Hotshots had some good players offensively as well. John Wolford led the league in touchdown passes, and Rashad Ross, his wide receiver, actually led the league in receiving touchdowns. But let's get to our final fantasy results. So you had picked Donnie Hagman from the San Diego Fleet. He was only able to get you one field goal for 3 points. I had picked Nick Novak, and he was able to come through for me. He got me 9 points off 3 field goals. So I guess that means I win the Alliance Fantasy Football League with a final score of 62-30. It's unfortunate because I was really looking forward to doing our final Alliance Fantasy picks this week where we actually do pick a full team. So it's a bummer because, I don't know, you could have caught me at the end.
You see, I'm kind of glad it's over. I was not faring well in that. I would pick people that did great the week before, and then they would inevitably do worse once I chose them. So I did not see this improving for me. And I'm almost glad that I don't have to suffer anymore.
Yeah, and I mean,
I like how you just say yeah to that. You're just like, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I say it like that just because, like I said, this was a league that I was a big fan of. And it's unfortunate that it is looking like it's going to be over. So before we do hit our NFL topics, I'm sure we're probably going to be talking about the AAF more. I doubt this will be the last time we talk about it. But for now, what are your final thoughts on the league?
I think while it was operational, it provided pretty decent football, and it did a great job of filling a void in the NFL season because it does get a little bit, I don't know if boring is the right word, but it gets a little hectic following the NFL offseason when you have a lot of moves, but you don't have a product on the field to watch. So it did a good job filling that void. But at the end of the day, when you look at it, it's sort of another failed attempt at creating a league as of right now.
My point on this is we did see some players show that they still have the ability to play in the NFL. You look at a guy like Garrett Gilbert. That guy can definitely be a solid backup, even maybe be a starter on a lower end team in the NFL. I think this shows that Trent Richardson could still have an opportunity in the NFL. You might say he didn't average the best yards per carry, but this guy scored a lot of touchdowns in the league. So you sign him and make him a goal line back, he could get you a lot of touchdowns. So I think this league did its job for the 8 games, the 8 weeks that they had games. I do think that some of these players did enough to have an opportunity to get back into the NFL or finally get that opportunity to play in the league. And I'm hoping that's not the last we hear of the AAF, but it does seem like that the AAF is done as we know it.
Sad day. Rest in peace, AAF.
Yes. Let's move on, though, to the NFL. So let's talk about our previous week's question of the week in regards to what we talked about last week, which is that pass interference and non-pass interference calls are expected to be able to be reviewed via instant replay. Starting next year, it is expected to be a 1-year test trial to see if they are looking to keep it going forward. We had basically asked if you are a fan of this new call, whether it be yes or no. Facebook had a split decision on 50%. Twitter was pretty close as well. 60% said no, that they were not a fan of this. We'll touch on this quick, but we both kind of seemed like we weren't on the yes train. We were more on the no train, correct?
I was definitely on the no train, yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be very tough to see how this works. I mean, I'm glad that they're only doing it on a 1-year trial basis to start, but if this ends up becoming a thing for years to come, it might be a little bit difficult to watch some of these games, but it's going to also be interesting to see how often we see a coach challenge these kinds of calls.
Yeah, it's just weird because there's such a human error element in aspects of officiating. And they have the technology in baseball to actually call balls and strikes without an umpire, yet they still use the umpire. Even though that technology is actually on the screen, they stick with the umpire because to some degree it just gets the game moving. And with sports nowadays, we're looking for ways to shorten them. So it kind of seems like it's going the opposite direction for trying to shorten a game when you have ticky-tack calls that could be reviewed. And it's taking that human element and it's not necessarily getting rid of it. Now it's putting a microscope to it. And now instead of a call you make in a split second, you have to look at that call over and over and over. And it's like, do you rule by the letter of the law? If a hand is on the jersey and grabs slightly, is it pass interference? All these things have to be taken into consideration. And I think that a lot of these calls are going to not be reviewed. They're going to be withheld. So there's not going to be indisputable evidence to overturn the call. But I think it's going to open up the rule book in a way that has never been opened up before in terms of micromanaging and putting that magnifying glass on what the rule actually is and whether you can or cannot call or overturn it.
Yeah, I agree with you on the point where it's going to be very tough to break down if in this case, if it will be pass interference or not, just because you have to look at when the ball is thrown. You have to look at where the ball lands. You have to look at where the receivers are when the ball is in the air. You have to look at where the initial contact starts. There's a lot of things that you have to look at, and that takes a lot of time, which means that games are going to run longer and longer. And I think the fans don't want to see that. They want to see quicker play, and having this can slow it down. But that's something we'll just have to wait and see if it is successful for year one. But let's move on. Let's talk about tax day. And the reason why I'm talking about tax day is because April 15th is tax day, and Russell Wilson has made everyone aware that the Seahawks have until April 15th to get a new deal done with him. Otherwise, it appears that he will not be discussing a new deal until after the season. So what are your thoughts on Russell Wilson giving such a tight deadline for a new deal?
I think Russell Wilson sees the money that's on the table that some of these lesser type quarterbacks are getting. And he saw the money that Case Keenum got last year. He sees the money being thrown around for these lower level free agents. He sees what Nick Foles gets paid. And he says, all right, I pretty much am the only guy on the team that really scores points, gets rushing yards, gets passing yards. Why not cash in and get my payday right here? and try to get it before I get injured. That's what I think Russell's looking at.
Yeah, and you look at it, he's expected to make 17 million for the 2019 season. And you look at a guy like Aaron Rodgers, the guy who has the richest quarterback deal, he's expected to make just over $33 million. I think that putting a tight budget on that or a tight deadline on this, I wouldn't say it's pushing the Seahawks because everyone knows on that team that Russell Wilson is the offense for that team, as you had said. So if you put any other quarterback on that team, I'm not sure how that team operates. So that's why they need to get this deal done before the offseason program begins on tax day. And if they do get a deal done with him before that deadline, do you think it passes Aaron Rodgers' annual salary per year?
I think it does, because that's just the nature of the beast in terms of NFL contracts, is that it's not paid based on the value of the player. And I'm not even saying that Aaron Rodgers is more valuable than Russell Wilson, because he very well might not be, but it just goes on who's the next guy that's the most desirable to sign. And so you know that if the Seahawks somehow didn't sign Russell Wilson and he was able to walk and become a free agent, that the bidding war for him would be immense. And so they have to basically partake in this bidding war and say, okay, we're going to one up the last salary that was given out. And so now that salary is probably going to be higher than the richest one of Aaron Rodgers.
Yeah, you look at it basically each offseason, whenever we see a high-profile quarterback about to hit free agency or get to that point where they need a new deal, basically the previous year's deal becomes that benchmark. So for Russell Wilson, getting to Rodgers' annual salary about $33 million for next year, I think that if he does get a deal done, it's going to surpass $35 million. And then next season, it's just going to become a huge bidding war to see who's going to be the first quarterback to get $40 million per year. But I think that if a deal does get done, it's going to be in that $35 million per year range.
Right. I would agree with that. And I think we're going to continue to see salaries grow and grow and grow and grow. And I don't know when or if it's ever going to stop, because you're going to start seeing this at other positions consistently too, is whoever the next big free agent is or the next big hold that a team wants to keep on their team is going to be a higher and higher salary, because that's just the way it's trending. And I don't know how you can deflate that at this point in time.
Very true. And the NFL isn't really running out of money, so they can afford to, it seems like, continuing to give teams more money to sign people. So I said I think Wilson gets it done by tax day. Are you one that also thinks that?
I'm going to go with yes, because I think that they recognize the importance of Russell Wilson to the franchise and the city, and I think they're going to try to lock him up so that there's no doubts going into the season.
All right. Let's move on to some players that did get signed or switch teams. So we saw the Chicago Bears traded running back Jordan Howard to the Philadelphia Eagles. Makes a pretty stacked backfield there, although they've kind of had a lot of talented running backs over the last few years. C.J. Anderson, a guy who kind of resurged his career this past year with the Rams, he signs a deal with the Lions. And then well-known backup running back Alfred Brew, he signed with the Jaguars. So of these three, which one do you think makes the biggest impact?
I think Jordan Howard to the Eagles might make the biggest impact, because they've been looking for a guy who can actually carry the torch in that backfield and be more like the guy. They got Jay Ajayi, and it was expected that he was going to be kind of the workhorse in the backfield, and he did break some long runs during their Super Bowl run, but he never really panned out as an every down sort of back. And they've been working with a lot of different running backs in the backfield. They've had Darren Sproles, Wendell Smallwood, Garrett Blount was there, and they've had this sort of patchwork backfield that to some degree worked. But I think Jordan Howard's a guy that can carry the ball more times than those other running backs and still find success. When I look at some of these other signings, C.J. Anderson to the Lions aren't traditionally a strong running team anyway. Their offensive line has never been that good. I think that he's going to kind of get lost in the fact that the Lions aren't a running football team. They're going to throw the ball with Matt Stafford a lot, and if he catches passes out of the backfield, then he'll be valuable. If he doesn't, then I don't think he'll have that much of an impact. Alfred Blue's sort of interesting because we don't necessarily know what's going to happen with Leonard Fournette going forward. There was talk about him perhaps being traded. So if he does get traded, and they don't pick up another running back, all of a sudden Alfred Blue could be seeing a lot more carries in the Jaguars backfield. And he's proved that he can be a solid, I don't know about starter, but a solid player as he was with Houston.
Yeah, looking at all these, I do think that Jordan Howard makes the biggest impact. We saw what he's done with the Chicago Bears. He had a fantastic rookie season with them, and he's put up good numbers there throughout his career. His numbers have diminished a little bit just because of the fact that Tariq Cohen came in, and he is a electrifying player as well for them. So I think the Bears kind of had to choose between the two, and I think they chose Cohen over Howard just because of the fact that Cohen is more of an all-purpose kind of running back, and I think that's what fits the Bears' offense more now than Jordan Howard. Jordan Howard, I think, is an upgrade from Jay Ajayi. Jordan Howard is a guy that can be multi-dimensional, and he's not as injury-prone as Jay Ajayi has been throughout his career. Coming off of some major knee injuries, it's going to take him a little bit to get back. I think Jordan Howard upgrades that backfield quite a bit for the Philadelphia Eagles. I think it's a big win for them in that trade. Looking at the other two signings, C.J. Anderson had a great comeback when he did sign towards the end of the season with the Rams. And you look at that backfield now, you got Kerryon Johnson, who's coming off a solid rookie season, Theo Riddick, who's basically the passing down back. So C.J. Anderson doesn't necessarily have to fill a huge void. He's going to have that opportunity to basically give Kerryon Johnson some breaks in games, and he showed enough last year to the point where he can still be a valuable back in this league. So even if it gets to a point where they maybe cut him towards the beginning of the season, I think he will find a job in this league because he still has some ability. And then the Alfred Bruce signing, I'm actually a big fan of that signing because he's been a valuable backup running back in this league, and he has shown signs of being a capable starting back in this league as well. And the situation in Jacksonville is very tricky. Leonard Fournette's had some issues. As you had mentioned, there were possible trade rumors before, but I think they're starting to look to keep him. T.J. Elgin also had some issues. He played sparingly well last year, but also struggled quite a bit. And they never really found that solid number two back to go behind Fournette. So I think Alfred Blue could be that guy that helps get the Jacksonville Jaguars running game going again. So I'm actually kind of a fan of all three of these moves, but I think Jordan Howard for sure has to be the biggest impact move for either one of these teams.
I was surprised the Bears let him go. I thought they had a good 1-2 punch going with Tariq Cohen as the third down pass catching back, and then Jordan Howard as the more aggressive pound it downhill back.
Yeah, it was a little bit surprising, and specifically because Howard, I believe, has had a 1,000-yard season in each of his years in the league, which doesn't really make sense on why you would get rid of a guy that as good as Jordan Howard has been. But I think the reason why they got rid of him is because the NFL has become more of an up-tempo spread game, and I feel like Jordan Howard's running game doesn't necessarily fit that more. He's more of a traditional I formation kind of back, in my opinion, but it'll be interesting to see how the Eagles use him going forward.
Yeah, and I wonder if he'll get lost in their mixed backfield or if they'll actually give him more of a starting role.
Yeah, and I think he will get that opportunity. Like I said, there are many backs there. Darren Sproles, Wendell Smallwood, Josh Adams. So it'll be interesting to see how the carries get split, but I do think that when it comes down to it, Jordan Howard's going to be the guy that gets the majority of them going forward. We did have an NFL player retire recently. Texans safety Andre Hall called it quits. He is most notably known for coming back last year after being diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. That's a pretty big thing to come back from, and especially to play a season after having that disease is definitely a big thing to note.
It's great to have that story that he came back from Hodgkin's lymphoma because everybody loves a comeback story, and that's awesome that he got the chance to come back and play again after that, which is obviously such a scary thing to happen in somebody's life. I have never actually heard of him before this, to be honest. Have you?
I know I don't think he was a huge time player for the Texans. He did start a little bit and was a big member of that team, but I don't think he was Obviously, he's not like a big name player in that team, like a Jadeveon Clowney or a J.J. Watt or a Tyrann Mathieu when he was there. So I think because of that team having so many big names on defense, he kind of like hid in the shadows a little bit.
Yeah, to some degree. I don't even remember it being a very big deal when he was diagnosed either. So seeing the retirement, I don't know, it's sort of going to get glossed over in the news, I think. But it's probably good for him to move on from football, as it is a dangerous sport, and he's already cheated death once.
Definitely. There was an interesting signing extension that happened recently. It was the Cowboys giving an extension to Randy Gregory. Randy Gregory is currently suspended by the NFL for previous substance abuse policy issues. Were you surprised by this?
I was surprised by this, especially with the NFL trying to clean up its image a little bit and get rid of, obviously, the drugs, get rid of the domestic abuse sort of situations. And Randy Gregory has had issues with both. So the fact that he is still being extended is very surprising to me. We know that he has a lot of talent, but at some point I would think that the Cowboys would just want to let him go. They're supposed to be America's team too. So why are you extending this guy who you know does not represent the NFL in a positive way and is still suspended? He can't do anything for you at this point.
Yeah, I was a little bit surprised when I saw this, but after thinking about it, it didn't really surprise me too much because remember, they did sign a guy who's had some off-field issues before, a guy named Greg Hardy, a guy that they did give a chance on. So as much as you want to say that for them being labeled as America's team, it doesn't seem like the right move. This isn't the first time they've done this. They have been known for getting guys who have had some issues, whether it be on or off the field. Randy Gregory, Greg Hardy. Look at when they got Terrell Owens, a guy who's had a lot of on-the-field celebratory issues. So this isn't a surprising thing now thinking of it, but I mean he hasn't really been a huge time playmaker for that team. He's been around and he's been able to do some nice things, but it's kind of hard to extend a guy after being suspended and not actually going through a full season.
Yeah, it's sort of like, is it worth the hassle is the big question. And at this point, I don't believe it's worth the hassle. Maybe they're trying to sign and trade, but I would be sort of surprised at that if any other team would be willing to trade anything for Randy Gregory.
Yeah, and if you look at a team that might be willing to trade for a guy who's suspended that might have a bright future, let's talk about the Cleveland Browns because they actually did do a trade recently, and they actually have a position for Gregory that is needed apparently now. So they had traded defensive end Emmanuel Ogbah to the Chiefs for safety Eric Murray. This was a trade that wasn't really talked about too much with all the news that happened this past week. So who do you think won this trade, Cleveland or Kansas City?
I think Cleveland won the trade simply because Kansas City's defense was already in pretty deep trouble, especially with the secondary at this point, losing a lot of players, and they just got rid of Eric Berry. So to trade another safety was somewhat surprising to me, and I feel like it depletes even more an already depleted Chiefs defense.
Yeah, I'm actually going to take the opposite point of this. I think the Chiefs won this trade. The reason why is because that secondary struggled quite a bit last season, and Murray was one of the ones that struggled for them. I think they're looking to get some guys in the draft. They want to kind of restart on the secondary, and I think getting rid of Murray was a smart decision. And you get a defensive end that helps fill a void on the team. Remember, they no longer have Dee Ford after trading him, no longer have Justin Houston. So this fills a void for the team, which I think is more needed than going after a safety or looking to get a safety. They can go to the draft for a safety because a lot of the top draft picks this year are going to be defensive linemen. So you can wait and get one of the better defensive backs in the draft when the Chiefs pick, which is later on in the first round. So I think this was a smart decision for them, and I think that Cleveland also gets a player that I think could show potential in Murray, but I think that the position needed was more filled by the Chiefs. So I think they won the trade.
I think that's a good perspective on it. I just think that the secondary was one of the biggest issues for the Chiefs. So I think that they should have tried to stockpile a little bit more depth and talent at that position, because we saw last year their passing defense was absolutely horrendous. Their run defense obviously wasn't the best, but they did better at blocking the run than they did the pass, in my opinion.
Yeah, you do make some good points on that. And they did have a good job getting to the quarterback last year. So it'll be interesting to see how this pans out for both teams. And also interesting to see how much playing time both these guys get after a lot of moves that the Browns have made this offseason, and then Chiefs also making some moves, but still kind of staying in that top tier of the NFL. But with that said, let's move on to our next topic, which is going to focus on the NFL draft. We're only 3 weeks away from the NFL draft, which means we're only a couple weeks away from our annual mock draft. So this week we're looking at top offensive draft prospects. So we're going to be ranking our top 5. Ryan, who do you have in yours?
Sure. So I did this based on my opinion on which prospects are better, not necessarily on which prospects I think are going to go first in the draft. So you'll notice one notable player is not on my top 5 because I don't actually think he's going to be that great of a pro. But at my number 1, I have Kyler Murray, obviously a very explosive player, highly talked about, especially after he actually came in a little bit higher with his height than people thought that he would. So he's number 1 for me. I think he'll probably get drafted number 1, either by the Cardinals or with a trade out. I think he'll be taken number 1. Then I have Jawaan Taylor, offensive tackle from Florida. Jonah Williams, offensive tackle from Alabama. Drew Lock, who I am actually pretty high on as a quarterback prospect. I slipped in at number 4 here. I know you'll disagree with that. And then at number 5, Cody Ford from Oklahoma. And you'll notice that the name that's missing is Dwayne Haskins. I don't really like 100% of what I've seen from Dwayne Haskins. I think his mobility could be an issue, especially if he goes to a team that has sort of a shoddy offensive line. And I'm just not sold on him as a prospect 100%, so I did not put him in my top 5. I think Drew Lock is going to end up being a better pro.
Yeah, it's a very strong list you have there. I do kind of agree with you on the point that the Dwayne Haskins is kind of a question mark. We've talked about on the show some of these Ohio State quarterbacks that come into the draft high don't necessarily have the best success in the NFL, so that'll be interesting to see on whichever team does take that chance at Haskins. I agree with you on number 1. I think Kyler Murray is the best offensive prospect in this draft, has a great opportunity to go number 1 unless he somehow falls back a little bit, Cardinals go in a different direction, or we see a team trade up and possibly take him. But I think he is the best offensive prospect in this draft. Number 2, I actually have Jonah Williams from Alabama. Offensive tackle is one of the most important positions in the NFL. The left tackle is actually, I believe, the 3rd highest paid position in the NFL. So getting an offensive tackle is definitely something that you need in order to build some success offensively in this league. Number 3, I have DK Metcalf from Ole Miss. This guy put up phenomenal numbers in the combine. He's had some injury issues, but I think that with his outstanding performance, he's also shown some big-time playmaking skills in game. I think he could be a playmaker long time in this league. And I think whoever gets him in the first round is going to get a steal if he ends up slipping. But I think this guy could go top 20 for sure. Number 4, I actually have a tight end. I have T.J. Hockenson. Hockenson from Iowa. A lot of people are thinking I was going to say Noah Fant, a guy who was a big name a couple years ago. But T.J. Hockenson kind of slid past Fant this season. I think both these tight ends have the ability to go in the first round. But I think Hockenson definitely stepped up his play, became that number 1 tight end for the Iowa Hawkeyes this past season. And then my 5th and final prospect is actually going to be the offensive lineman from Florida, who you had mentioned earlier, Jawaan Taylor. You look at Florida team that improved drastically this past season. That was because of an improved offensive line play, and he was one of them. And as I've mentioned this before, tackle is a very important position in football. I would know. I played tackle in college football, so those are basically the main guys that you need on that offensive line because those are the ones guarding the fast pass rushers on the end, and you need to make sure that you have those in order to keep your quarterback safe.
Yeah, offensive line is one of the least sexy picks that you can make in the NFL draft, but it's so important. And you never really hear about those guys on the offensive line doing good work. But whenever a team succeeds in the Super Bowl, their offensive line is at least solid. You never see a team with a terrible offensive line winning playoff games and winning the Super Bowl because that's the foundation of your team. When you give your quarterback time and you give your running backs lanes to run in, to be completely honest, it doesn't even matter so much who the quarterback or the running back is. They're going to get the job done behind a good offensive line.
Yeah, and I remember just when I played college football, obviously, like, the offensive line, they don't get talked about as much as obviously like quarterbacks, running backs, receivers, any of those positions. But their success comes from the offensive line. If they're putting up good numbers, getting protected well, it's because of that offensive line. So as much as you want to say that quarterbacks are the stars of this league, I think the linemen are the true stars of this league because they have to put up with the most intense blocking that will happen in the league.
Yeah, and they always say, too, that the only time the offensive linemen ever get noticed is for something bad like a holding penalty.
Yeah, and let's be honest, holding does happen on every play. It's just a matter of if you get caught with it or not. But if you're that good in the NFL with not getting called with it, that means you're probably doing a pretty good job of hiding it. Or maybe you're not actually doing it. But that's something that I know we talked about. It does happen a lot. It's just a matter of who catches it.
So you heard it here first from a lineman. Holding happens on every play.
And I'm not saying that every person does every play, but
you're saying every person who's any good does it every play.
I'm just going to say that it happens every play, whether it be everyone or at least one person.
Fair enough.
But with that, we are towards the end of our show, which means we'll be talking about fantasy football. And this week, we're going to be looking at strategies of how to draft. So, Ryan, I'm not sure if you've done this, but I've drafted for both standard leagues and PPR leagues.
Indeed, I have.
All right. So, what are your thoughts? Do you say that when drafting for both these leagues, it's pretty similar, or do you think you have to draft differently when it comes to either standard or PPR?
Well, I think that the way you draft is pretty similar, but who you draft and who has more value in the draft obviously changes depending on if you're doing PPR or standard. So in PPR leagues, there's obviously a greater emphasis on pass catching because you get some semblance of points, whether it be a quarter of a point, half a point, full point for a reception. So what that does is it takes players that could be like third down running backs or slot receivers who might not accumulate huge totals of touchdowns or yards, but do get a lot of catches. And it suddenly makes those players taken much earlier in the draft because of the point value that they can produce. So an example of this could be Christian McCaffrey, a Tariq Cohen, a James White. All of these guys are viewed as multi-dimensional players that instead of just pounding the ball inside, they're catching passes on the outside a lot, trying to make plays and screens and things like that. So now each time they get a touch that's a pass, they get an extra point. So whereas these players could be, Chris McCaffrey, a second rounder in a standard league, all of a sudden based on next year will probably be a first rounder, but this past year, second rounder in standard leagues, first rounder in PPR league. And same thing with most of these other players like a James White, Tariq Cohen. Whereas James White might not be a dependable starter in a standard league, he is a dependable starter in a PPR league because of his value out of the backfield as a receiver.
Yeah, looking at it, I feel like we're kind of on similar touch here. Drafting-wise, it's somewhat the same, but the type of players that you go after, that can kind of change where you do end up drafting. I feel like in PPR standard points, you want to make sure you get running backs. You want to make sure you get wide receivers. So that might mean you're not drafting quarterback till past the 8th round. You want to make sure you solidify the best PPR players you can, which are the running backs, which are the wide receivers, which are the tight ends. So quarterback becomes kind of that fourth position that you actually do look at later on in the draft. And there are a lot of guys, as you mentioned, that you need to look at more, especially at the running back position, because there are different backs that typically go in the games on third downs, like a Tariq Cohen, like a Jamal Williams, or guys like that are specifically used for third down passing situations. So when it comes to this, you do have to kind of strategize a little bit more. And I know I've running a league for the past 5 years. I feel like every year I get asked, is this a PPR league? Are we going to do a PPR league? And I always say, nope, we're going to do it the same, just because people who do PPR leagues, for the most part, they have a great strategy on doing it. So you change something to a PPR, it can throw off a lot of people unless others have had success. So there are different strategies in order to do it, but it's more based on where you might get those second tier players and possibly making them first tier players, in my opinion.
The thing that I don't like about PPR is that it's not necessarily based off of production, because every time you catch a pass does not necessarily mean that you're doing anything super useful. So you could have one catch for 1 yard and you end up with 1 point out of it, when in reality, you didn't really do that much as a player. You got 1 yard on a reception, which if you just run the ball for 1 yard, you have the same result, but you don't get nearly the same point total. So I like that it's production-based, and it sort of makes everybody equal to some extent. And it does place a higher importance on a quarterback position as opposed to just people that catch the ball. Because in PPR, suddenly people that don't have that many receptions aren't as useful as they are otherwise.
Yeah, and that's why I'm a fan more of standard than PPR. And I mean, I can't recall, but was our league last year PPR, half PPR, or was it just standard?
I think it was standard.
Okay. And are there any plans on changing that to PPR?
No, and there's a couple people that always ask me, they're like, are you going to go PPR? And I usually just say no, because I like the simplicity. I don't like to have to look at Julian Edelman's 60 yards but 15 receptions and realize that that's a huge point total.
Yeah, definitely agree with you on that. And with that said, Ryan, that does bring us to the end of this show. So what final thoughts do you have for the viewers listening?
Thank you, viewers, for your continued support. Be sure to follow Brew Sports and Touchdown Tuesday on Facebook, and also follow us on Twitter for both Brew Sports and Touchdown Tuesday. We have a question that Ian puts out every week, which usually gets pretty good engagement, and they're usually entertaining, and we talk about it the next day. So please continue to follow us and look for us on iTunes, Spreaker, and Google Play.
Well said, Ryan. Again, we are Touchdown Tuesdays, the official football podcasters of Brew Sports. We are on Facebook. We are on Twitter. We now have over 200 followers on Twitter. So if you want to continue our increase in getting more followers, feel free to do so by searching the handle at TDWN2's podcast. Also, make sure to keep up with our buddies' basketball podcast as well, Run It Back. And then we are still in the works of getting our baseball podcast going. Hopefully, we're able to get that going in the next month or so. And then just make sure to keep listening each week. These next few weeks are big episodes for us as we dive more into the NFL draft and get ready for our mock draft to come shortly before the NFL draft. Again, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Touchdown Tuesdays, and we will see you next week.